Lesson 48, The Silent Village. In the previous lesson, we talked about noise. In this one, we'll talk about silence, the silence of a village. Why was the village silent? Now listen to the text and answer this question. 村庄为什么是沉默的?
In this much-traveled world, there are still thousands of places which are inaccessible to tourists. We always assume that villagers in remote places are friendly and hospitable. But people who are cut off not only from foreign tourists, but even from their own countrymen, can be hostile to travellers. Visits to really remote villages are seldom enjoyable, as my wife and I discovered during a tour through the Balkans. We had spent several days in a small town and visited a number of old churches in the vicinity. These attracted many visitors, for they were not only of great architectural interest, but contained a large number of beautifully preserved frescoes as well. On the day before our departure, several busloads of tourists descended on the town. This was more than we could bear, so we decided to spend our last day exploring the countryside. Taking a path which led out of the town, we crossed a few fields until we came to a dense wood. We expected the path to end abruptly, but we found that it traced its way through the trees. We tramped through the wood for over 2 hours until we arrived at a deep stream. We could see that the path continued on the other side, but we had no idea how we could get across the stream. Suddenly, my wife spotted a boat moored to the bank. In it, there was a boatman fast asleep. We gently woke him up and asked him to ferry us to the other side. Though he was reluctant to do so at first, we eventually persuaded him to take us. The path led to a tiny village, perched on the steep sides of a mountain. The place consisted of a straggling unmade road, which was lined on either side by small houses. Even under a clear blue sky, the village looked forbidding, as all the houses were built of grey mud bricks. The village seemed deserted, the only sign of life being an ugly-looking black goat on a short length of rope tied to a tree in a field nearby. Sitting down on a dilapidated wooden fence near the field, we opened a couple of tins of sardines and had a picnic lunch. All at once, I noticed that my wife seemed to be filled with alarm. Looking up, I saw that we were surrounded by children in rags, who were looking at us silently as we ate. We offered them food and spoke to them kindly, but they remained motionless. I concluded that they were simply shy of strangers. When we later walked down the main street of the village, we were followed by a silent procession of children. The village, which had seemed deserted, immediately came to life. Faces appeared at windows. Men in shirt-sleeves stood outside their houses and glared at us. Old women in black shawls peered at us from doorways. The most frightening thing of all was that not a sound could be heard. There was no doubt that we were unwelcome visitors. We needed no further warning. Turning back down the main street, we quickened our pace and made our way rapidly towards the stream where we hoped the boatman was waiting.
So why was the village silent? Right, it was silent because the author and his wife were unwelcome visitors. This text starts with an introduction of a misconception, which is people in remote places are usually friendly. Then the author tells us that this assumption can often be wrong. He proves it by his own experience, a visit to the Balkans. They were first in a town which they seemed to have enjoyed for its attractions. But then, in order to get rid of other tourists, They set out to explore the country by themselves. It should have been a pleasure, but the village they explored was silent. Though it was silent, the hostility was evident, so that all of their pleasure was spoiled. Right, now let's look at some language points in the text. In this much-traveled world, much traveled means traveled by a lot of people. Much is often used as a prefix. Let's look at more examples. He is a much respected member of staff, means he is a member of staff who is respected by a lot of people. For a young child, the death of a much-loved pet can be a terrible blow. 对一个很小的孩子来说，非常喜爱的宠物如果死掉的话，会成为一个非常重大的打击。There are still thousands of places which are inaccessible to tourists. Inaccessible, here it means difficult to reach. Let's look at more examples. Many houses on the hillside are inaccessible to cars, which means you can't drive to these houses on the hillside. Why is opera so inaccessible to so many people? Here, inaccessible means difficult to understand. 为什么这么多人都不能欣赏歌剧呢？ People who are cut off from foreign tourists. Cut off from something means separate from something or isolated from something. For example, many villages have been cut off by the heavy snow. Or you can also use cut off to describe a kind of feeling. Living in the country, she felt cut off from her city friends, which means she felt isolated. Can be hostile to travelers. Hostile, 抱有敌意的. You can describe an attitude or a look or a mood with hostile. Look at this example. His new neighbors were rather hostile to him. 他的新邻居对他抱有敌意. Its noun form is hostility. Old churches in the vicinity. Vicinity means in the surrounding area. For example, there are several hotels in the vicinity of the railway station. Look at this example and see what vicinity means. The price is said to be in the vicinity of $10,000. In the vicinity of an amount means approximately, 大约接近$10,000. Beautifully preserved frescoes. Preserve means maintain or keep something from damage or loss. For example, these traditional customs should be preserved. 这些传统应当保存. Freezing is a common way of preserving fruit and vegetables. 冷冻是使水果和蔬菜保鲜的一种常用办法. Several busloads of tourists. It means several buses of tourists. Load here is used as a unit. Look at this example. Coachloads of football fans were arriving at the stadium. 挤车的球迷. She came back with a carload of shopping. 买了一车的东西回来. Descend on means a large number of people come without warning and very suddenly. Look at this example. Sorry to descend on you like this, but we have no time to phone. We expected the path to end abruptly. Abruptly means suddenly. For example, their conversation ended abruptly when I came in. It has another meaning, which is rudely. For example, he said abruptly that he was not the least interested and then hung up. 粗鲁的。We tramped through the wood. Tramp means to walk with heavy steps. Look at this example. I have tramped the streets all day looking for a nice gift for my mother, which means I have walked the streets with heavy steps, meaning very tired and exhausted. There was a boatman fast asleep, means sound asleep, 熟睡的. Fast is often used together with these verbs. For example, the man was fast stuck in the chimney, 紧紧地塞在烟囱里. She held on fast as the car suddenly turned, 紧紧地抓住. The place consisted of a straggling unmade road, 一条蜿蜒的没有修筑的路. Straggle means move or spread untidily. For example, tourists straggled to this part of the country in the early 80s. Straggled here means came in small number. Weeds straggle over the garden. 野草在花园中蔓延生长. Was lined on either side by small houses, which means small houses were on either side. Look at more examples of using line as a verb. The avenue was lined with trees. Thousands of people lined the streets to watch the procession. Line the streets means they stood along the streets. The only sign of life being an ugly-looking black goat. Sign of life means sign of activity or movement, 动静. For example, the door was open, but there was no sign of life. Sitting down on a dilapidated wooden fence. Dilapidated means run down, tumbling, in very bad condition. It's especially used to describe a building. For example, the hotel we stayed in was really dilapidated. Or, in this example, you're not going to drive all the way to California in that dilapidated car, are you? 你不会说就开着这辆破车去加州吧? All at once. All at once means all of a sudden. My wife seemed to be filled with alarm. Alarm here means fear and anxiety. In the previous lesson, we learned car alarms, 是警报. But here alarm means the feeling of anxiety. Look at this example. She turned in alarm as the wind blew the door open. 她警觉地转过身来. Children in rags. In rags means wearing torn clothes. 穿着破衣服的. For example, the beggar was dressed in rags. In English, there's a saying, from rags to riches, meaning turning from a poor person into a rich man, 是指由穷变富. They were simply shy of strangers. Here, be shy of means they were simply unwilling to meet strangers. Look at more examples. I don't think she will be shy of publicity. 我可不认为她会不愿意抛头露面. Men are often shy about sharing their personal problems, which means men are usually unwilling to share their personal problems. The village immediately came to life. Come to life means suddenly began to show energy and motion or excitement. The original meaning of come to life is to become alive. For example, the story is about a statue that comes to life. 这个故事讲述的是一座雕像获得生命的故事. The game really came to life in the second half. Here, come to life means the same as the text. Means the game really became exciting. in the second half. Men in shirt sleeves. In shirt sleeves means not wearing jacket on top of shirts. 就是衬衫的外边没有再穿外衣。In some countries, for example, it's not proper for men to show up in their shirt sleeves on formal occasions. 有些国家呢，只穿衬衫被认为是一种不正式的服饰。Glared at us. Glare at means look at angrily. For example, she glared at him accusingly. 她很谴责地瞪着他。To describe look at fixedly, the text has another phrase, which is peer at. Old women in black shawls peered at us from doorways. Peer at means look at carefully or with difficulty. For example, she peered at the tag to read the price. 为了看清楚价钱，她费劲儿地看着标签儿。英文中有的动词强调动作，有的描述状态。The author of this text describes the setting of the village with both these kinds of verbs. Let's look at them. Taking a path which led out of the town. Led 这是一个描述动作的动词。We expected the path to end abruptly, but we found that it traced its way through the trees. And a further example, the path led to a tiny village. So notice all of these verbs are active verbs. They are used to describe the path leading to the village. He also uses several verbs describing stillness. So these verbs are used in past participle so that the stillness is emphasized. The path led to a tiny village perched on the steep sides of a mountain. My wife spotted a boat moored to the bank. The rope tied to a tree. All of these are descriptive verbs. They emphasize how silent the village was. So in this text, the author tells us about his own experience in visiting a remote village which was hostile to tourists. No matter his story is true or not, many tourist attractions are located in remote places. And many of these remote places are also poverty-stricken areas. So developing tourism naturally becomes a resort to the economic problem. But there comes a paradox. Developing tourism will often spoil its original scenic beauty, as well as the local people's way of living and even way of thinking. Therefore, we often end up in a lot of tourist attractions, finding that the landscape is becoming more and more stereotyped, and the people becoming more and more commercialized. The author talks about this silent village. It is frightening to see a silent village, but if the village is no longer cut off from the outside world, a noisy village might be even more frightening. All right, so much on the topic of this lesson. I'll see you next time.